Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. So Rick, in the last episode, we spent some time thinking about how you evolved as a thinking person growing up in capitalism. And you mentioned that your work was profoundly influenced, among other thinkers, by the work of Louis Althusser. So we want to spend this episode thinking about how Althusser's work influenced your understanding of Capital, Marx's most mature work. But before diving into the secrets of the commodity, use value, exchange value, surplus value, and all the rest of it, I just wanted to take a moment to emphasize something spectacular, something that had a profound impact on me when I read his work. So there's this book called Reading Capital by Althusser and Balibar, in which he says something really interesting. He says, and I quote, that there is no innocent reading of Capital, so we must say at the outset what reading we are guilty of. I found that statement extremely magical, if you like. And he goes on to say that it all depends on what you see and what you don't see and all the rest of it. So I'm going to start with a provocative question. What reading of Capital are you guilty of?
Yes, that comment of Althusser's and his writings about these things was very impressionable for me. It was for Steve Resnick, I should say. Also, we talked often about that. Mm-hmm. Because it had the impact on us. And as I thought about it, it came to me that both Steve Resnick and myself had been trained at the elite American universities, particularly in economics, because we both got our PhDs in economics, by teachers, good, bad, and in between, but who all shared a basic view that it would make no sense to ask the question, which reading are you guilty of? Because for them, they were all aspiring to what they believed to be the correct reading of anything, whether it be Marx or Adam Smith or John Maynard Keynes or anybody else. For them, we were all trying to understand how the economy works, and we were reading and studying others like ourselves who had tried to figure out and who had made good steps forward, which is why we were reading them, and we would build on them, and people would later read what we did in a wonderful accession, slowly, asymptotically, to the truth about the world. Mm-hmm. And Althusser taught us what we, of course, should have been taught in courses in philosophy as students, courses in epistemology, because that's the branch of philosophy which asks, what does the word truth mean? Yeah. But we were all pursuing something whose nature we didn't think was complicated and never required a course, and none of our teachers ever thought one was necessary either. And so what Althusser taught us, which was something which once you hear it, once you get it, you can't understand how you didn't know that all along, and you can't understand why there aren't other people who see that too. So what Althusser meant was everybody brings a context to the text. Whatever the text is, it is surrounded by a context, its framework, its assumptions, its visible and not so visible implications and associations, if you begin to borrow from psychology and so on, and that you can't separate the one from the other. The boundary between the text and the context is hard to discern and is variable and moves around, and you're stuck. You're stuck with the fact that everybody does their own reading, bringing their own particular context to the reading. And really, it's why one person is driven to tears by a poem, and another person is completely unmoved.
Mm-hmm.
Why we sit next to somebody in a movie theater, watch a film, and come up with completely different reactions to the film because the film is different for each of us because the context shapes the text and vice versa. Once you see that and once you understand it, and it isn't all that complicated, then of course you must ask the question, is there a particular reading? Is there a set of contexts that are brought to the work of economics by the economics profession? And the answer is absolutely. And the minute you ask the question, it almost answers itself. Our profession, our teachers, are all people, with very few exceptions, I mean, literally hardly any, for whom capitalism is either the best of all systems, or the latest of all systems,
Or the only one.
or the only one that's kind of imaginable if you're really bereft of any historical awareness. But if you are aware that there was a feudalism and there was slavery, then it's the best and the humans can do, and therefore there's no need and no purpose in worrying about alternatives to it or other things. Wow. Wow, they actually believe that. And they do. When you have conversations, which Steve and I did in our department with our colleagues, we wanted to test the proposition, and we immediately were shown, yes, for them, it's a collective effort to get at the truth. They actually believe that. They've never questioned it. The whole idea of questioning it had never occurred to them. But to be fair, it hadn't really occurred to Steve and me either, caught up as we were without being aware of it in this way of thinking and never having had a course in epistemology. We had done some reading in philosophy, which is probably what made us vulnerable to what Althusser was teaching. So there was something there. But I think, to be crude about it, I'm guilty of a reading which was already based on a notion that the world as we have it is deeply flawed, not acceptable, and that human beings can and should do better in general, and we in particular, Steve and myself, that's what we should be doing. And if you're going to have a critical attitude towards capitalism, a sense that the human development doesn't stop here, well, then you read Marx guilty of that way of thinking. That's the context, the ideas you bring to your reading. And given what Marx says about himself, that he too was a revolutionary, and here I should mention, many of the people who study Marxian economics don't ever take the time or trouble to read the non-economics of Marx, which is a shame, because there you'll find the explicit crafting of the context. Now at least you know what Marx brought to the work he did, and you can at least ask the question, maybe my reading, if it isn't informed with that political, ideological agenda, would be different from Marx's own, of what Marx himself wrote. It got so bad, to give you one way of putting this, that when I was a professor at UMass, I got frustrated over the years that students were studying Marx's economics because in their minds, and I understood why, this was another model. They love to say that. There's sort of the neoclassical model and the Keynesian model, and then there's the Marxian model. Yeah, but this is homogenization. This makes them all
The same.
in the same effort to understand how it really is. And even teachers I learned a lot from thought that way, and I didn't. I came at it because I had been taught, tutored in the much broader Marxian tradition, Marxist literary criticism, Marxist historiography, Marxist, you name it, and reading much of Marx's other work that isn't economics. He was a journalist for many years. He wrote lots of articles about news items. He wrote about literature, and on and on. And the Marxian tradition since, some of the greatest people, Rosa Luxemburg, Lukács, Gramsci, were not economists. I was not particularly interested in economics, but I read those people and with great avidity. And so I taught a course at the University of Massachusetts for many years called History of the Marxian Tradition, whose real purpose, and I would say this at the beginning of each semester, is this business about it's not another model. This is a different project. This is not to celebrate capitalism or to understand it particularly in some abstract, neutral way. This is a work of somebody who wants to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And I would emphasize, just to shake the students a little bit, he's an opponent. He believes the human beings can and should do better because it is a failure. It's better than what went before in many ways. Absolutely. That's to be understood. That's true, by the way, of every system did better than the one before. Human beings do try to do better, but it is a project of critique and surpassing.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you will read it very differently from the way you will if you do have that. Last point. Nobody's a neutral. If you say you don't have a neutral, it's like saying you read without a context. But the problem with that is that that's not possible. No human being. That's like saying you leap over the Empire State Building in the afternoon for exercise. I understand what the words mean, but I also understand you can't do that, and therefore there's something wrong with you for saying it. That's my attitude towards I'm a neutral here. Jean-Paul Sartre has wonderful writing he does about during the French resistance to the Nazi occupation of part of France, when every priest would have a moment with parishioner, often in the confession booth. Which side are you on? Are you a Nazi or are you a resistor? And the answer, I'm neutral. And the priest would then have to explain, no, you're not. You just don't want to deal with the situation, which does not make you neutral.
Yes.
If you don't resist, you're a collaborator. That's the problem. And for me, I have much that attitude, always have had. I understand why people say that. They don't want to deal with answering the question, what is the context I bring? Because then they would become part of the conversation, and the question would be, well, why, dear person, do you bring that context? In other words, why are you not a critic of capitalism? That must mean that you, in some sense, endorse it, and are you really ready and willing to do that? So I think what Althusser wanted us to understand was that there is no innocent reading. We are all guilty in the sense we bring a context. I don't think he meant guilty in the sense that your context is bad. It's that you bring one, and we would all be better off, presumption of the human mind, if we're conscious of what we're doing than if we are not. That would help. Let's think about the different context we bring.
Mm-hmm.
But I've noticed that in the economics profession, more than any other I know, there is resistance to that. Historians are required to study alternative historiography, the different way people conceptualize what it means to study or to write history. But they don't do that in economics. They do it in anthropology, they do it in psychology, but in economics, the notion that we really have different is resisted. Keynesians want to get rid of the neoclassicals want to get rid of the Keynesians, and one of the few things that Keynesians and neoclassicals can agree upon is to get rid of the Marxists. This is tragic because it feeds a notion that the others really are not in the club. You don't do economics unless you do it the way we do.
Yeah. And I find it particularly intriguing, sometimes irritating, what you're talking about, especially given the fact that if anyone goes through the trouble of reading Marx's Capital, and looking at the exchanges that he was having with his buddy Engels at the time. So I was reading one of his letters yesterday, where in 1867, like literally a few months before the publication of Capital, so he writes to his friend and says that I was reading. He asks Engels to read the Unknown Masterpiece by Balzac, and just for the viewers, the story is of Fraunhofer, this painter, who's been preparing his masterpiece for multiple decades, and everyone knows about it, that Fraunhofer is working on this work of art. And then, well, 12 years later, he invites his audiences to look at what he's done, and no one can understand what he's done. So Marx says that I find it delightfully ironical that, as he's going towards the publication of Capital, he's still thinking about these anxieties. So what I'm trying to say is that I find it particularly ironic when readers of Marx today turn around and present the book as if there is only a way of writing it. Do you think, given you've obviously read these exchanges with Engels and you know about them, so do you think that the mode of presentation, the way Marx has presented his work in Capital, and he was clearly very, very anxious about it, do you think that readers of Capital should pay attention to that particular point? And if so, why is that relevant to the way Marx presented his work?
Okay. Simplest answer is yes, Marx was enormously anxious. In his correspondence, not only with Engels, but with others, he talks about it. So we know that he played with this way of starting. He's famous for having made the remark, the beginnings of everything are very difficult. How to start, where to start. I believe that was part of his philosophic self-awareness, that the truth of anything is what you begin to understand when you come at it from a multiplicity of contexts, of angles, of approach. And if that's true, then there's something arbitrary in where you start. Right? Why here? Why not there? Why this one second and that one first?
Yeah.
And so he's aware, and since he's on it, he's aware that that must be a problem for him too. It's not just a problem for everybody else who writes or who thinks. And I'll come back to it for a minute. But before I do, I want to say one more thing about the earlier points we were discussing. Unlike most of the economists over the last 2-3 centuries, and unlike most of his contemporaries, and in fact, unlike the only man I can think of who gets what Marx does, is a man who used to teach at Harvard, well known in the profession, named Joseph Schumpeter. Unlike everybody except Schumpeter, perhaps, Marx devoted himself to an exhaustive, critical engagement with the profession's range of approaches. If you take the published work, Theories of Surplus Value, 3 volumes, available in English, as well as translated in many languages, you will there see a remarkable collection of notebooks, that's really what they are, in which Marx writes in great detail about Adam Smith, about Malthus, about Ricardo, but also about many, many other
He literally
economists.
writes their works down.
Yeah,
he copies and then he
sections, and then
it's almost
makes,
theological.
Yeah, it's really. But here's a man who writes from a particular critical perspective, but is respectful of, deferential to people who disagree with him. He celebrates, if you read it, Adam Smith in a number of ways. What a genius, how he figured this out. What a problem that he couldn't take this another step when he would have seen this. And what an amazing piece of work. And then we see that in the aftermath of Marx, 99% of his critics never did it. Never did for him what he had done for their forebears. And there's something there. This is a man who took seriously the epistemological, or if you like, philosophical question, that there is much to learn from people you disagree with if you take the time and trouble to do it. And Lord knows the bourgeois economics profession has a lot to learn from Marx, but unlike Marx, does not take the time and trouble to do much more than dismiss in a crude way that says more about them than what it ever said about Marx. Now, as to to this question, I would use the following metaphor. Every painter, the one in Balzac's story, but every painter, is forever working, or I shouldn't say every, most painters are working and reworking their canvases. They're noticing that the color at this point isn't quite today what I thought it was 3 weeks ago. So they adjust. If you look at many famous paintings, if you do the technical chemistry, it's many layers, layered on top of one another. Well, what's obvious and what can be undone chemically with a painting can also be done, metaphorically speaking, with writing. Think of it this way. Marx understood that writing is a process in which you try to verbalize with words a thought you have about whatever your object of writing is. But you're going to engage that object differently in 3 weeks from the way you did today. That's because the object has changed, and so have you. And therefore, the interaction between you and whatever the object is, a jar of peanut butter, an analysis of interest rates, a software program, you're constantly layering over, and you don't want to get rid of what you wrote last week because there's an authenticity to it. There's something there which you don't want to lose, but you want to add or change. And so it becomes very difficult once you see yourself having done that already for months with your manuscript. When do you stop? It's one of the great problems of all writers. When do you stop? Students, particularly graduate students, confront that because they're working for months and months on a dissertation. And at a certain point, their professor, if the professor's any good, says, stop. Is it the best it could be? No. Is it the final word? Not at all. There is no such thing. But you have to stop at a certain point. Otherwise, you will never get this piece of paper certifying that you're a PhD, which you need to feed your family and to live your life. Well, that's the problem of a writer. If you want to get a book out there that helps people understand what it is you've done, and Marx was certainly interested in doing that. Remember the biography, if you know Marx's biography, before he sat down in the British Museum to write all this stuff, he had been an activist. He had gotten arrested picketing and striking with workers back in Germany. That's why he was exiled from Germany. So this is a person who wants to change the world, who writes, and who therefore wants to impact the world with his writing. He has to stop. But he's worried. He's worried about two things. He's not done. Seeing the progress he's made in the past year makes him want to continue, which, by the way, Marx did. So where do you stop? Where do you say, basta, I'm going to put this writing out there? That's a big problem for him. And the second one is he actually knows better than anybody the different ways one could get at the material he's written about. And how do you know which one to put first? That's why he's so anxious with Engels and the others to talk about, I did it this way. Why did I start with the commodity?
Yeah.
I could have started with labor. After all, he didn't use this language, but he could have said to himself, I write the labor theory of value. I will be known for the labor theory of value. Shouldn't labor and value be like in the first sentence or paragraph? And it isn't. And why? But then again, other people don't know that the crucial thing is labor. How do I get them? Do I hit them in the face by starting that way? Or do I start where they're comfortable, where they are acquainted with where things in economics should start, and then take them analytically and logically, like a teacher, to where they ought to be focused instead of where they are focused? All these questions are going through, and in the end, he has to stop. And he stops somewhere. But none of us should be stuck. We are not obliged to start where he did. In fact, if he's a good teacher, and he really is, he'll give us enough to be able to say it might be better here and now to start somewhere else. On Marx's project, but we're not in Marx's context. We are not subject to the same influences and pressures that he was. And so maybe his lesson can be better conveyed by starting somewhere else, by proceeding in a different way. Remembering we're going to be doing the same kind of layering of alternatives that he struggled with. But we are his comrades if that's what we're doing, even if we don't end up with the same decision on the layers we put first and which one we put second, and so on. But it is a multi-layered work. And I would conclude by saying that many good, great works are like this. Read them more than once. And not because of some abstract notion of learning, but because the people who wrote this were aware of layering, and it's there. And you're going to get different things this week than you will 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now. Great poetry, great novels are like that. And great works of social analysis are like that too. You had a master here, a master of philosophy, Hegel's student, and a master of economics, self-taught, under duress in the British Museum, etc. He brings an extraordinary historical moment and an extraordinary personal situation and produces a multi-layered work. You will get a lot from it if you read it from time to time, not in its entirety, but you'll see in an early chapter of Capital, which is where I would suggest, how different you remember it from how it is today when you read it again. It's worth it.
Wow. I'm going to return to this issue of the commodity and why he starts with that in a moment. But I want to take a step back and actually start with something that I've always found really intriguing. He says that his aim in the book is to study, discern, explore the laws of motion governing a capitalist economy. And when I first read that, that sounded like really Newtonian to me. What exactly does that mean? Firstly, the laws of motion governing a capitalist mode of production. What is a mode of production? Is capitalism a mode of production? And if so, how is it different slash similar when we compare it to other modes of productions? Is that too many questions?
No, they're good questions. The way I would respond to the first part is I would use a different word because it's the way language has evolved. I think what Marx was after was what we would now call systems thinking or systems analysis. The people who didn't ask about systems, which is the norm in economics, right? They don't deal with systems. They don't really know how, and they don't want to think of systems because if systems are born, evolve over time, and die, then that would be likely true of our system. And we know that our system was born and we know it has evolved, which means
we don't want it to die.
That's what's coming next, death. And people's difficulty in dealing with their own death is parallel to their dealing with the death of the system. And one way to handle that is to say, well, I'm not a system. It's a little bit like, if I dare go there, in some ways, people who can't really manage the concept of death erase it by a concept of everlasting spiritual life, or whatever you want to call it. I think Marx was used to reading economists who thought that what happened had to do with what people wanted or desired, that it came out of things like that we could describe with attributes of human behavior. To give you a modern example, why do we have profit? Answer, people are greedy. Oh, and for Marx, this is not an answer because it only means that you ask the question, okay, if they do what they do for profit because they're greedy, why are they greedy? You haven't answered the question. You just changed the question, but you think you've answered it because you don't want people to go that next step. Well, Marx, is a critic, so for him this doesn't work, but he wants his audience to begin to think systemically, to be cognizant that there's a system, and therefore that there's something making people be the way they are, explaining their behavior. If they behave, if they, for example, and this is a terrible word we might want to talk about later, if people choose to do something, well, okay, but why did they choose what they did? Why did they consider these 6 alternatives when we can show them there were 11 others that they didn't think about or know about, which means that the system occluded their awareness, so the choice is shaped, even if there's some element of choice. You haven't solved the problem, in other words, by saying that there was a choice, because you have to explain why they chose the way they did. Now, some people take that to an original human nature. That's a whole nother debate in and around Marxism, whether there is an innate humanness that somehow explains what Marx is trying to explain by a systems analysis. But I think that was the point. He wanted people to think systemically, that what people do is shaped by the totality within which they live. You are born, literally, you are inserted, from your mother into the world, and now you have to cope in that world. But you didn't make that happen. Literally, other people, your parents, made you happen. So there's the first clue that you're not the origin of what you do. So I think that's what this was about. And yes, he used this term mode of production, and it has been terribly diversely interpreted. Let's put it that way. I think all it means is he wanted us to take another step about what system it. What is this system that shapes the way the world works? And he wanted to talk about an aspect of the system that was systematically neglected by his contemporaries. And that's production, the details of production, which other people, including economists, either denigrated, ignored, minimized.
Because they wanted it to be about the market.
Yeah, right? They wanted production, market. We're going to get to that. Markets, or other institutions that they found terribly, the church, or who knows, the schools, or the family, all kinds of guesses about those who would think at least a little bit systematically were interested in other systems. So what he wants to do is he wants to teach systematic thinking. And I should underscore, remember, he comes at the end of the bourgeois revolution out of feudalism, which celebrated the individual, was critical of religious ideology that comes out of the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation. It is not God who directs the details of the world. It is we individuals. We are each of us godlike. God made the world. We make the world. It is, we are the cause, the world is the effect. That's neoclassical economics, right? The economy is simply the effect of what lots of individuals as workers and consumers, and then again entrepreneurs as producers of goods. We interact with one another, each of us pursuing our own self-interest, and the end result is society. The economy comes out of individual choices. They love that. That's pure ideological parallel to what goes on everywhere else. Others have shown, Marxists often, by the way, that, modern biology focuses on the cell. Why the cell? Because it's the individual. And the totality is the product of what each cell is doing. And then there's an endless pushback by the more structuralist thinkers. No, you have to explain why the cell is what it is, does what it does, and that depends on the environment. And again, notice text, context, the parallels here. So Marx is pursuing teaching about system. Now he's taking it a further step. I want to talk about the system most of you don't talk about. I want to talk about the system of production. I want us to go and stop looking at it as, to use my neoclassical professor's language, not the black box of production, sort of the details that no one has to care about what you do with a hammer and a nail if you're busy making a chair. It's not interesting, it's details. No, that turns out to be very interesting and very important. You have neglected something crucial. Much of Marx's work is respectful of people who went before him. So he's not reinventing the wheel. It's not, I start from scratch. They have understood much. I am interested in supplementing, but I'm aware that when you supplement, you also change everything. So I understand I'm doing that, and I want to because I want a new system. On the other hand, I have to get in there and show people that something they have neglected is profoundly important. That's my job. If I had to summarize what Das Kapital as a book is, that's what it does. I'm going to show you two things. One, that production is crucial, and two, how it affects everything else. Awesome. Not as its ultimate cause, but as an influence on everything, which is why you need to be attentive to it. It's a little bit like, here, study psychology because it affects everything. Study the family because it affects everything, etc. All right. So then what is production? And there people have done something kind of strange, even within the Marxian tradition. First, they divided it into two different things. And of course, not everybody does what I'm about to describe, but in general, this is happening. They call one part of it relations of production, and the other part of it forces of production. And the mode of production is the combination of relations and forces. Forces, we can use an English word, technology. It means how human beings are interacting with nature, the knowledge we have, the skills we develop. How do you transform a tree into a chair, a sheep into a sweater, and so forth and so on. Relations of production are sort of how we relate to one another, as we go about producing things. And that got understood in the Marxian tradition as having to do with property ownership, so that some of us relate to production as people with property. We own land, we have money, we may have capital equipment like machines and factories. And then others of us don't have those things. So some of us are propertied, and some of us are propertyless. And the relations of production refer to the distribution of those two positions, and maybe some in the middle, people who have a little property or the wrong kind or something. And I think that this is a very sad evolution. I understand why it happened. It happened because technology has fascinated the human race from the beginning. It is constantly being developed technology. We learn how to get more apples out of the tree, more ounces of gold out of the soil, etc. And we're constantly engaged in trying to do that. People did it in ancient times, people do it now. More problematic is, why did we make property the issue? Well, this has to do with the fact that the distinction between those who have and those who don't is thousands and thousands of years old in Western culture, and probably in Eastern cultures as well. What do I mean? Well, human beings have assigned importance to this question of property for a long time. In early days, there was what you might say the importance of denying property, of not having private property, of property being the collective owned land or animals of village economies, of tribal economy, and so on. Then later, with the revolution to private property, the endless struggles between the haves and the have-nots, which Aristotle and Plato talked about, and everybody since. And so when relations of production are thought about, everybody brings that tradition and says that's what he must have meant. And since Marx was also interested in the distribution of wealth and property, and therefore very much talked about it, it only seemed to strengthen the idea that's what the word mode of production means.
Thank you.
However, I don't think so. I think Marx meant something else. I wish he had been more explicit about what I'm about to say, but I would argue and I would defend that this is what he meant. He meant literally what he said, the relationship among people. It's not what might lie behind that. The relationship between the person with no property and the person with property is a very particular relationship, can take many forms. But it's the relationship is one thing, the property distribution is another. All right? So, for example, Marxists have often written that capitalism presupposes the separation of the mass of people from ownership in the means of production. But of course, that's wrong. Slavery is the separation of masses of people from ownership of the means of production. The slave does not own the horse or the plow or the knife or the hammer or himself. I mean, if anything, it's an even more separation of property. And you could therefore not use the separation of the mass of people from property as a way to distinguish capitalism, since it applies at least as much to slavery. And I could go on. So where am I going? I think what Marx meant was the relationship, which is what he talks about so much in Volume 1 of Capital, that one person is the employer of another. That's peculiar to capitalism. There was no wage in slavery. The slave did not sell his or her ability to work for 8 hours a day, for a week, none of that existed. And likewise in feudalism, the serf was not paid a wage by the lord. They had no such relationship. The serf swore a personal loyalty to the Lord. There were ceremonies for that. We know all of that. The Roman Catholic Church sanctified. It does to this day, not the same ritual, but the same function.
Wow.
So what will you have in capitalism is a different relationship in which one person sells to another person their brains and muscles for a particular period of time in a particular context. So it's not slavery. The employer cannot buy and sell that person. No personal swearing of loyalty is involved. The employee would laugh at the idea of swearing personal loyalty. I don't care about you, employer, at all. You pay me, I show up. You don't pay me, I'm gone. I have no connection to you. I don't want one, and you don't want one with me. We have a contract. That didn't exist before either. We have a contract that's a purchase and sale contract. I'm going to sell you my time and energy, and you're going to buy it, and then we're going to struggle about what that means. Very interesting, complicated. I think that's what Marx means. And here's the reason why. And for those of you who know what I write, and this will not come as a surprise, I think Marx is after something much more revolutionary than most of his readers have understood. He didn't just want no capitalism. He didn't want feudalism. He didn't want slavery. He didn't want the whole idea that a small group of people are in a position to control, to direct, to literally threaten the lives of a mass of people. And he didn't want that for the same reason that people like you and me don't want a king, don't want a czar, don't want a dictator, don't want to fill in the blank. What Marx wanted, because he was a Democrat with a small d, he always was, he loved the French Revolution. Why? Because of that, because of the impulse of the people to rise up. But he was smart enough to understand, how do you institutionalize that? And the answer is, you change the mode of production and you change the relations of production so it isn't any small group of people telling and controlling another, not masters over slaves, not lords over serfs, and not employers over employees. What is the alternative? You can call it a worker co-op. You can call it whatever you want. It's when the workers, the former employees, become their own employers, and that the difference between these two, the class structure in that sense, is ended. Because they're all the same class. There is no division. He's an extraordinary radical because that's his goal. What was wrong with his predecessors, because he's a critic of, he learned from all the revolutionaries that went before him, but he's also wanting to take it further. They thought, the Robespierres, the Dantons, the fill in the blank, they thought that you could replace capitalism with another system without understanding that if that other system continued to have a small group of people in production making the basic decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue from production, then you would not have gone. So I know I'm loading this, but if, for example, what you do is get rid of the private owners of the means of production, the private employer, and you replace it with a state apparatus of some kind, so that the state becomes the employer, you have fought against and overcome private capitalism, but you have replaced it with state capitalism. You haven't made the break. And given the world today, this implication of Marx's analytic has enormous consequences for the struggles going on in every country today and for the significance of Cuba, China, North Korea, Vietnam, and all the other countries that have tried to go beyond private capitalism, been able to get a significant amount of state capitalism going, sustained it. What does a Marxist have to say about that? That is implied in all of this, and that is a matter of the greatest immediate relevance of any question I could think of.
Wow. So what I'm hearing is that for Marx, it's about, and correct me if I'm wrong, the manner in which work is organized.
That's right.
And in particular about, he's interested in the relationship between the people who actually do the work.
That's right.
They use their nerves and muscles to convert an input into an output, and the people who make decisions about it,
Right.
which could be them, but in many historical cases is not, and
Right.
that's the struggle that Marx is kind of
Right.
pointing towards, which also leads to this thing that he keeps talking about, something that economists these days forget very easily, that capitalism, as he understands it, is not an eternal mode of production or economic system. It came, it saw, and it's going to die.
Right.
Just as slavery before it,
Right.
feudalism before it, Asiatic modes of production, and all the rest of it. Yet, and this is where it gets a little intriguing for readers of Capital, he wants to get at that criticism. Yet, he decides to begin his analysis, which is his choice of entry point stuff that we discussed in our last episode. Why does he decide to begin with the commodity? That's for the first part of my question. And if you could please define the term for us, the commodity and non-commodity dichotomy. What is at stake in this? Why does he? So there's two parts to my question that I'm fascinated by. Firstly, why does he start with a commodity? Is there a reason? Should we read more into it? You know, he loves the commodity. He's fascinated by its mystery and all the rest of it. I get that. But why not start with the surplus directly? What is at stake in this commodity non-commodity distinction?
Good. The first and simplest answer to why he starts with commodity, in my mind, and I believe I could find the quotations from him to show this to you, is because it was the norm in what other economists of his time did. That was the number. There are two reasons, but that was the big one. In the literature of economics, which after all he was entering, he's writing what he intended to be a book. We know it's the first of 3 volumes, given the way it was finalized, but at least since he didn't write the volumes 2 and 3 as finished works, he was dead, and so other people did it. But he did pretty much define the first volume. This was going to be a book. Now, in mid-19th century Europe, if you write a book about economics that's that thick, you're talking about a very small percentage of the population who are ever going to see it, let alone read it. This is not going to be the working class, unless a few educated workers, which he hoped for, and he worked to get the book to them. And he even wrote pamphlets and so on to help get these ideas out in simpler, shorter form. Very famous ones: Wage, Labor, and Capital, Value, Price, and Profit, and others. But I think the first part of the answer is that's what people thought economics was about. It was about what? Those things that are all around us. What we buy in the store, what we see being produced in the factory, what is being carried by the horse-drawn carriages of the time. We're surrounded by, as he writes, a world awash in commodities. The second reason he did it is that the working class, the average person, to the degree that they thought about the economic system at all, thought that way too. And the first two reasons affect each other. It's because, in part, because the profession, small as it was, talked about the commodity all the time, and that everybody seemed worried about it, in a way I'll get to in a minute, that the average person, even if all they were was a worker or a consumer, which most people were, also thought that this is what the whole economic system is about, this flood of things that I'm constantly buying, including myself, because I'm selling my labor power. I mean, and what am I concerned about? What is the great issue for me? My wages. How much, how's this exchange going to work? I'm literally and it wasn't lost on people, I'm selling my ability to work. And I'm dependent on the exchange ratio. How much money am I going to get for the work I do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Marx understood if he was going to write a book that people were going to be interested in, think is relevant to their own concerns, and therefore buy it and read it, he's got to start there. It's got to be familiar enough to draw them in. But he had a problem. His own theory told him that what matters, what is not adequately understood, is this other thing, production. And I don't mean the technology of it. I don't mean how the hammer works with the nail to make the chair. It's what they don't understand is the relationships they're entering into are not necessary, are not the only ones there've ever been, therefore could be other. Therefore, we have to ask the question, why don't we do it in another way? Might that be a lot better? All of this opens up a universe of interesting questions which people had no way of conceptualizing. I want to use a metaphor that makes this point, at least I think it does, easier for people. And I'm going to overstate it to make it simple and quick. Before Freud, if you had a nightmare, you might have woken up and wondered, what did I eat that was not good last night? I ate some potatoes and they weren't good, or I had a bad egg or whatever, right? And then at a certain point with Freud, you begin to ask a completely different question, which no one had asked before. What are the details of the dreams you can recall? And what do they tell us about the repressed material in your subconscious? I mean, and we have seen in the centuries since Freud writes that this opens up an immense new world of understanding human life, the human condition, for society and for each of us as individuals. Okay, this was a conceptual breakthrough by a medical doctor who was actually looking for something else and stumbled on this, but had the determination to see. Marx is like that. He opens up, Althusser says this, a continent, the phrase of Althusser. He opens up a whole, and what he meant was by asking these questions about production, he opened up a whole new universe. But he had to get his audience from what they would buy the book for. Economics about commodities, about markets and how they work. And then he could take them in a few chapters, brilliantly written, so that they would follow him and see that their very interest in the commodity logically brought them to an interest in production, which he would now elucidate for them. So that's his strategy. Not the only one you can use. Another writer would have hit him over the head right off the bat with labor and surplus and all of that. He chose, we know that he did the work because we have the dates on which he produced the other manuscripts, which shows he was fully aware of all of that. But he chose, that goes back to our layering conversation before, he chose not to put that there, but to take the reader to the theory of the value and surplus by starting somewhere else. Now, very important for me to explain very briefly, I hope, why this was reasonable for him to do for reasons beyond what I've mentioned. The fascination with commodities is as powerful, if not more so today, than it was when Marx writes. So it's really important to understand where this comes from, why we have it, because otherwise you won't be able to break out of it now, let alone at the time Marx is trying to reach you by writing his book in that particular way. So here's the reason, and it gets to the definition of commodity, non-commodity. Human beings have been using their brains and muscles to transform nature to sustain themselves for thousands and thousands of years. The output that they achieved, we can use a term output. It's sowing the ground to grow the corn, which you then eat.
It's the product that we have at the end.
It's the product.
The good or the service.
The good or the service. A lot of words we have for it. The output, the product, the good or the service. Marx would later call it the use value, and he wasn't the only one. That was fairly common, that use value exchange. He didn't invent that. So that's very old. What is not old is an institutional arrangement that interposes between the producer of something and the consumer of something a very particular activity that because, for example, in an ancient village, right, John and Mary make bread, and Fred and Alice don't. But Fred and Alice have to eat bread to survive. So the community has to arrange for the producer of the bread to produce it and get it to the consumer. And there's lots of producers of different things and lots of consumers. Now, we don't have to have that problem if we have what's called self-sufficient producer. If I'm a peasant family and you and I are workers on that family and we have spouses
We can
and
just
children,
subsist.
we work and we consume. And there is no issue. It's the same people. It's a little bit like talking before about production. If the employee and the employer are the same people, it's a wholly different relationship that comes out of that. Okay. But in societies what develop after a while, they all discover what Adam Smith wrote about in The Wealth of Nations, that if I make the bread and you make the pots and pans and she makes the sweaters, we'll get more output for the same amount of labor than if we all do everything ourselves. So the minute you have a division of labor in a community of people, then you have a problem. How do you get the output of the specialized worker to all the consumers? And one of the ways to do that, often used, was to have the leaders of the community, a priest, a council of elders, a goddess, a chief, a head man. Societies have had endless ways of doing that, who distribute the word. Maybe with a religious ritual. Once a week, at the back of the temple where everybody prays, there is a distribution of bread in there. And the decision is made by whoever's in charge. You have a lot of children, you get 4 loaves of bread. You have 2 children, you get 2 loaves of bread. And there can be disagreement about it and changing the rule. But now comes a moment in history when a very particular institution is established to exist systematically between the producer and the consumer. And that process is called exchange. The producer comes with whatever they produce, bread, software programs, hamburgers, whatever it is, and confronts the consumer and says to the consumer, I will give you 4 of whatever I'm selling if you give me 3 of whatever you're using to buy, either some product you've produced or whatever it is you might have. That process is called exchange. And when a product of human labor that is consumed by somebody who wants it goes through an exchange process, it gets the name commodity. And that's all a commodity is. The product of labor meets a need in the community and goes through the process of exchange between the producer and the consumer. So that's why people should understand, if I whittle out of a piece of wood a little doll and give it to my son or my daughter, this is labor, this is work, this is output, but it's not a commodity because I don't sell it to my daughter. I could.
There has to be quid pro quo, kind of.
That's an exchange. That's what the word quid pro. Something you get, something you give, something. And the place where this is done is called the market. The market is. It used to be in the old European languages. It used to be where you go to do your buying and selling. That's why, for example, in French, walking somewhere is to marcher, and the market is called the marché.
Oh, wow.
It's the same word. I mean, it's just, and you have that in lots of places because it became the social event because it had to be done repeatedly. You know, a farmer's market is every week or more often than that. So it becomes the social gathering in a way. The only competition it had was the church. which you also went to every week. But people had to go to the market, didn't have to go to church. Anyway, so the market, now here's why I'm telling you this. The market is much more than an institution arriving for particular reasons we haven't gone into historically at a certain point. But it has unbelievable ramifications. I'm going to give you one because it's relevant to what Marx is doing and what economics did. It produced in human beings what you might call the second great anxiety. What's the first anxiety? The first anxiety is, will I get enough to eat? Will I have shelter so I don't get freezing or rained upon? Do I have clothing so I don't freeze? That's your first, can I sustain my physical self? The second one is the market. What do I mean? Well, if you were busy producing your own sustenance, you just worry about, will I be able to raise enough corn, have enough chickens, and all that? Or leave it at that. But now suppose that you not only raise chickens, but you sell them. You go to a market. You now have two anxieties. One, how many chickens will I produce?
Where to sell it, how to sell it.
But not the second question, what will I get for selling? Suppose this year I produced 400 chickens, and I went to the market, I sold them, and I was able to feed my family. I'm okay. Great anxiety. Suppose next year I bring 400 chickens. I'm just as successful. I've raised all the chickens. I bring them to the same market on the same friggin' day, but I only get X, much less for the chickens than I got before. I am devastated. The fact that I produced as well as I did before counts for nothing because I am shaped by the market depriving me of my life because I can't get more than for my 400 chickens. What happens to my brain? My brain wants to answer the following question. What determines the price of everything?
Wow.
What determines the price of my chickens relative to the price of all the things I need to buy? My shirt, my pots and pans, my child's medicine, whatever it is. And the question on the mind of the people, they've learned over generations how to raise chickens, how to cultivate the soil. Go take fish heads you don't eat and plow them in the soil. It refreshes the soil. They have ideas, however primitive, of the forces of production.
Wow.
But they don't understand this new institution that has created for them, on the one hand, fantastic opportunity. They do somehow understand that if I produced everything I need myself, I wouldn't be able to get as much as if I concentrate on chickens and sell them for all the other. Those are little exercises they give you in economics. All that, simple-minded stuff. Anyway, they get that. They have learned, even though there's anxiety, there may not be enough rain. And they worry about that. And they pray in church for less drought and more, all of that. But they have a whole new problem, which is the market. And they want there to be, and the economics profession is the response to this social demand. Explain to us what in the hell determines prices.
Wow.
We at least have to know what is coming down the pike rather than being overwhelmed. It's better to know a tsunami is coming than not to. It's not good to know, maybe, but better than ignorance. And so the economics profession is born, and it is the obsessive concern of the economics profession. Then when it's born in the 18th century, and now, what determines everything is about the market? You have to answer the question, why is that? if you understand that economics can't take it all for our colleagues, they take it all for granted. Well, it's the way it is. But if you have any sense of evolution, that's the answer. And Marx is aware of this conundrum. Now we understand why there's this fetish about price and why that's another reason why start with the commodity, explain it. Believe me, it won't be difficult, and Marx does it in 4 or 5 chapters, to take you in volume 1 from the commodity and the market to the production sphere.
Amazing.
He tells you it's not well understood. I'm going to give it and show you why it's important. And that's why he sets up the book that way.
Amazing. Thank you, Rick. I'm going to continue with that question. Where do prices come from? What is the theory of value? How does this connect with Marx's particular theory of value? And all those interesting questions. But unfortunately, we've reached the end of our episode, and I'm going to continue with this particular conversation in particular. How is this connected with Marx's theory of value and all the rest of it in the next episode? All right, friends, until next time, I'll see you for the next episode. Take care.